Hi, so we're back again today, and we're going to be talking today about the mass media. And specifically, we're going to be looking at how the media affects public opinion. So it's important to cover the mass media when we talk about political behavior, because the media, and by media here I'm talking about news, I'm talking about the internet, I'm talking about newspapers, magazines, blogs, etc. They are the primary conduit of information about politics for most citizens. You can certainly go to Washington, D.C. and sit in on a Senate hearing, or um, attend the meetings of the House when they meet on the floor, or even go to court. But most people don't do those things. Most people instead rely on other people to go and report on what they've seen and bring that information back. A lot of people criticize the media on the grounds that it doesn't provide very good information, that the media may be biased ideologically in one direction or the other, or that sometimes the quality of the coverage is just very shallow. It doesn't necessarily tell you the kinds of details that you may want to know, or the kinds of details that are necessary to know in order to make a really well-reasoned decision. So let's assume that the media is biased. That raises the question then of whether it matters. If the media is biased, if it's either conservative or liberal, or maybe some outlets are conservative and others are liberal, does that actually affect political discourse in the US? Does that change how individuals think about politics? In the political science world, we refer to this as media effects. In other words, the effects that the media has on the populace. So traditionally, again, if we go back 50, 60, 70 years ago, the assumption was that the media would provide people with information. So if you read the newspaper every day, you would have more factual knowledge about what was going on in the world, and you would carry that knowledge with you from one day to the next. We also expected that the media would have a power of persuasion, that when you read a newspaper article that was perhaps biased in one direction or another, maybe it was biased against the current president, that that would shift your own perception and you yourself would become biased against the current president. Or if the news media seemed to have a bias in favor of being tough on crime, that would make you, as you read those articles, be tough on crime or feel like that was a good policy. This sort of view of the media was sometimes referred to as the hypodermic needle hypothesis, which is kind of clunky and a little bit intimidating. But basically, what it means is that when you consume the mass media, when you consume a newspaper article, it's like getting a shot in the arm of information and ideology, and that changes you. It changes you physically. Um, in the 60s and 70s, we shifted our perspective of how the media affected individuals, um, because of a number of really quite sophisticated experimental designs that attempted to determine whether these views of the media or these expected effects actually worked. So, for example, there were a number of experiments done where individuals were asked to read newspaper articles, and then they were asked questions the following day about what they had read. Did they remember any of the factual information? And by and large, they did not. Most people would be able to answer factual questions about what they read within, an hour or so of having read the newspaper article, but by the next day that information was gone, and certainly within a week, it was gone. With respect to persuasion, again, we expected to see that as people read a biased newspaper article, if we measured their beliefs before they read it, and then they read it, and then we measured their beliefs after, we should see a change. We did not. So all of this research started to suggest that the media really has no effect, that people don't remember the information, and it doesn't change their beliefs. This perspective of the media became known as the minimal effects hypothesis. Again, the idea being that the media has a minimal effect on individual public opinion. During the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s, we have done even more sophisticated experimental research. And we now understand that, yes, the media does have an effect on individual attitudes and public opinion, but those effects are more nuanced than the hypodermic needle hypothesis would have you think. They're more subtle. So today we talk about three primary media effects, and those are agenda setting, priming, and framing. I'm going to go through each of those individually. So agenda setting, as the name suggests, is a function of how important you think an issue is. So in other words, if you are asked to rate the 10 most important issues facing the nation today, and you come up with your list, and global warming is number 9 on your list, and then you are asked to read a bunch of newspaper articles and half of them deal with global warming, and then you're asked to rate the top 10 issues facing the nation today, again, global warming is likely to move up in that chart. It's now not going to be number 9, but maybe it's going to be number 4. Right? So that's kind of an oversimplification, but basically when we encounter news stories about particular issues, we start to see those issues as more important. We start to see them as more significant to our lives. This effect tends to be increased when a story about a particular issue is what we call a lead story. So if you're watching the TV news, that's when Dan Rather, is Dan Rather still alive? I don't know. When, Tom Brokaw or Dan Rather or whoever is hosting the news says, tonight we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. But first, here's a story about, some war, right? That is a lead story. Or if you read a newspaper, sometimes newspapers will talk about stories that are above the fold. If you've seen physical newspapers, which we have around campus, they are folded in half, and lead stories are at the top of those pages, so they are above that fold line. If you go to CNN, right, or one of the other online news sources, the lead story is the one that has the big headline, right? That's the lead story. So when an issue is covered by a lead story, that really solidifies the notion that the issue covered is important. It really, instead of global warming moving from number 9 to number 7, if you read the lead story about global warming moves from number 9 to number 3, right? It just magnifies that effect. In addition, that agenda setting function is heightened when a story has a particularly vivid or emotional component. So pictures, particularly color pictures, emotional interviews with individuals, sort of dramatic imagery, personal narratives by somebody who's affected by an issue. So for example, if you don't just read a story about unemployment rates, but you read a story about unemployment rates and the reporter talks to someone who has lost their job, right? That increases that emotional engagement, makes the story more vivid, and the agenda setting function ends up being much stronger. Finally, agenda setting works more or works better when the person who is consuming the news lacks political sophistication. And I don't mean that here in sort of pejorative sense, like, that they're not smart or anything like that. Rather, I mean that if a person doesn't really have a firm grasp of the political process, they don't pay attention to the political process much. It's easier to manipulate their beliefs about what's important and what's not. Priming is a much more subtle phenomenon. So let's talk about priming. So psychologically, individuals are what we call cognitive misers, right? What this means is that we use our brains in the most efficient way we possibly can. We try not to store tons of information. We only take in ideally, we only take in sensory input that is relevant to what is going on. And we like to use cognitive shortcuts, what we call heuristics, in order to make decisions in a quick and efficient way. So we talked about this a little bit before when we talked about public opinion. And we talked about this idea that individuals don't walk around with fully formed attitudes stored in their heads. I hope you remember that. We talked about the fact that people's attitudes may seem to shift from day to day, and that the reason that they shift from day to day is that when you are asked, how do you feel or what do you think about this particular issue, you develop that attitude basically on the spot. It's that top of the head cognition. So you reach into the bucket of considerations and you cobble together an attitude on the fly. And then you let it fall apart, right? It disintegrates because you don't want to spend a bunch of brain power holding it. And then when you're asked again, you reformulate the attitude. And this time you may reach into that bucket of thoughts and come up with different considerations, come up with different factors that influence your outcome. So priming has to do with the media being able to move considerations up to the top of the bucket, right? I don't know why I envision the brain as a bucket, but that works for me. So the priming effect has to do with shifting primarily in the context of your attitudes towards a political candidate or a political figure, shifting the relative weight you give to specific issues in that evaluation. So let me explain with an equation. I know everybody loves equations. So imagine that somebody asks you how you feel about the president, right? On a scale of 1 to 100, we sometimes call this a feeling thermometer. How warm is your opinion of Joe Biden? And you reach into this bucket of considerations, and you generally think that Joe Biden is doing pretty well with the economy, but you disagree with him about abortion, and you think he's really neglecting the environment. So you reach in, and about half of your attitude towards Joe Biden has to do with how you think he's doing with the economy, and about 30% of that cumulative evaluation is your perception of how he's doing on abortion, and then about 20% is the environment, and those weights are random. So let's say that's how you construct your attitude or your evaluation of Joe Biden when you are first asked. Then you watch a story about the environment. It doesn't matter whether the story talks about Joe Biden or not. It doesn't matter whether the story is positive or negative. It doesn't matter whether it's talking about polar bears clinging to, ice rafts in the Arctic Ocean, or whether it's talking about reducing carbon emissions. It doesn't matter whether it's a good story or a bad story, or whether it mentions the president or even the United States or the government at all. It's just a story about the environment. You watch that story about the environment, and then someone asks you again, how do you feel about the president? And remember, you have let that evaluation dissolve, right? It doesn't exist in your head anymore. So now you have to reach into the bucket and you have to construct that evaluation again. Now, when you reach into the bucket and construct the evaluation, your evaluation is about 30% how weighted about how you feel Joe Biden is doing with the economy, still about, now 20% how he's doing with abortion. And the weight you assign to the environment goes up from 0.2 to 0.5. So again, if you initially thought Joe Biden is not doing well on the environment, right? He's doing a terrible job. I think he's neglecting the environment. No matter what the content of that story about the environment is, even if it's telling you Joe Biden is the most environmentally friendly president we have ever had, it doesn't necessarily make you think that Joe Biden is doing better with the economy. It doesn't change your opinion about how Joe Biden is performing with respect to the economy, but it makes your perception of Joe Biden's treatment of the the environment, it makes that component of your evaluation more significant. It just shifts the weight. So if you thought he was doing a bad job, watching a story about the environment is actually going to make you think he's doing an even worse job, even if the point of the story is he's doing a good job. Right? So it's a little counterintuitive. But really all that's happening is the weight that you assign to this particular issue is increasing. The third form of media effects that more recent scholars have discovered is something called framing. So probably you all take a lot of pictures now that you have cameras on your phone, and you, as a result, may have a more intuitive sense of framing than I ever did as a youth, right? You know the difference between taking a picture of your cat sitting on a windowsill all the way across the room, as opposed to taking a picture of your cat in close-up, right? It looks different, it invokes different emotions. The cat on the windowsill far away may feel more like a lonely picture, a sad picture, and then the close-up on the cat's face instead is more positive and warm, right? And it's not that you're taking a picture of a different animal or even at a different moment, it's just the way you have framed that picture. So with news stories, they also have frames. There's usually an attempt by journalists to try to tie a story that is happening now into a common narrative. So for example, one of the sort of empirical examples that was used in a study a number of years ago was about the Ku Klux Klan, planning an event on the downtown square in Columbus, Ohio, in front of the Capitol building. And there were a bunch of news stories about this issue. And some of the news stories focused on the civil liberties frame of the story. They focused on the idea that this story is about, or this issue is about, free speech and liberty. Other news articles or other news stories focused on the social order element of the incident. So they focused on the threat of counter protests, the possibility of violence, the need for police presence at this event. So the emphasis was just on a different aspect of the story. Frames have a tendency to take very complex issues and try to reduce them down into a pattern that is familiar. And that familiar pattern brings with it a bunch of emotional weight and a bunch of sort of intellectual assumptions. So where do these frames come from? The answer is some of them, they come from lots of different places. Some of them are culturally created. Some of them are created by what we call elites. My sort of the go-to frame to talk about that is generated by elites is the idea of people being either pro-choice or pro-life. When in the days before Roe versus Wade, when the pro-life movement was kind of gaining power and was trying to enact a lot of additional state statutes that would criminalize abortion, there was a counter movement going on. There was a group of people, of activists across the country who were fighting to liberalize abortion laws. And that group of people had a very conscious conversation amongst themselves about how to frame their position. What do we call this? The pro-life people, the people who are opposed to abortion have taken the name pro-life. That is how they have decided to frame their issue, that they are supporting unborn life. How do we frame our side of this debate in a way that is equally appealing? Interestingly enough, one of my former next door neighbors, the Reverend Jimmy Kimmy, was a member of an abortion rights group. And at an event that they had, she said, I really think we should go with pro-choice. She said, it's either going to be pro-choice or pro-liberty. Those are the two things people are talking about. And I think we should go with choice. And indeed, that is what the groups that wanted to liberalize abortion laws went with. And so now when we talk about the abortion issue, we always seem to frame it as a conflict between pro-life and pro-choice values. That was very deliberate. Both sides picked those terms in order to create a favorable impression for their position. The media also creates frames. Again, sometimes they talk about something as a civil rights issue. Sometimes they talk about it as a civil liberties issue. Sometimes they talk about intractable historical problems. There are all sorts of frames that you see come up again and again. If you watch Dateline, for example, there are particular narrative structures that Dateline falls back on every single time they're talking about a murder, right? It's weirdly comforting to sort of hear this frame, this narrative over and over again. It becomes kind of rote. But it is very much generated by the media. They're doing that consciously. They found a frame, a way of looking at murder as predominantly a function of intimate betrayal. And you see that over and over and over again. My favorite example of a cultural frame is this one. So this is from the TV show South Park. And it's three of the boys standing around their fallen brethren, and they're saying, oh my God, they killed Kenny, you bastards. If you take that language, oh my God, they killed Kenny, you bastards, and you remove it from the frame of South Park, that is tragic. A little boy has died, right? This is a terrible story. But because of the frame of the show, because we put that language into the context of these particular children, and we know that Kenny is, until I think like season 10, going to get up and walk away in the next episode, it's funny, right? It becomes something funny. So this language that in isolation, if it has meaning at all, it's tragic. Because of the frame of the television show, it is actually funny. Okay. So framing can then affect how you view an issue. For example, the experiment that I mentioned before with the Klan and their march in Columbus, Ohio. A number of political psychologists happened to basically be standing around on Ohio State's campus and said, oh my gosh, this is the perfect chance to do a little research. And they asked people to tell them, what do you think about the Klan marching? Do you think that they should be allowed to march or not? And then they showed them one of these stories. They either showed them a story that talked about civil liberties, or they showed a story that talked about social order and the sort of threat of violence. People who saw the story about civil liberties, after they read that story, they were more likely to support the Klan marching. People who watched the story that was framed as a threat of violence were more likely to say, oh, no, we should not let them march. That's a terrible idea. They didn't necessarily, those people did not necessarily say, or they couldn't necessarily say, this is why I believe this. I believe it because they have a First Amendment right to march, or I think they should not march because there might be violence. They didn't necessarily put those things together on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, the frame seems to have shifted their perception. So I just want to end with one really important note, and that is that while particularly your textbook talks mostly about the news media and some about social media, it's not just the news media that has these effects. Entertainment shows also have the same sorts of effects, the same agenda setting effects, the same priming effects, and the same framing effects. In fact, there is some evidence, actually some pretty good evidence, that entertainment media does this better than the news. So for example, there has been research that looked at a TV show called Chicago Hope, which you probably don't remember, but it was a hospital drama, right? It was like Grey's Anatomy. It was in between Grey's Anatomy and ER. It's kind of smack in the middle of those two shows. And some researchers looked at Chicago Hope, and they asked people they asked people questions about how did they feel about healthcare. And then they watched a few episodes of Chicago Hope. And then a little bit later, they asked them about healthcare again. And what they found was that people's sense of the importance of healthcare went up from watching the TV shows, and their evaluation of candidates shifted. So if they thought that a candidate was doing a good job with healthcare, and then they watched a healthcare related show, they tended to evaluate the candidate more highly after watching the show. You can imagine why entertainment media might do a better job than news media. Remember when we talked about agenda setting, and I said that emotionally charged or emotionally driven stories have a stronger agenda setting effect than a more dry newscast, right? So having the pictures, having the tears, having the interviews, that tends to increase that agenda setting function. When you watch an entertainment show, the informative part of the news is gone. It's all emotion. And it's not just a
2 to 3 minute story in the middle of a newscast. It's an hour, and it's something that you watch every week. Or sometimes you sit and watch for like 13 hours a day on a long weekend, right? So you are just bombarded by this emotionally charged, super vivid information about a topic that may have political consequences. So the research that has been done in this area has largely focused on health-related shows like Chicago Hope or ER or Grey's Anatomy, and on crime-related shows like Homicide, Life on the Streets, and Law and Order, things like that. People who watch Law and Order have a tendency to think that crime is much more prevalent than it actually is, and to see it as a much more significant political issue than people who do not watch the show. So I would encourage you to spend some time thinking about the media that you consume. I know a lot of you probably don't watch TV regularly anymore, but think about the TV shows or the types of shows you watch on YouTube or whatever kind of media you consume, and think about what are the political ramifications of the types of stories you are encountering. How might those stories, which are not intentionally political at all most of the time, how might those stories be affecting your political views? Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to find the place to stop the recording. There we go.